So it's working? Okay. All right, time being 5 o'clock, quorum of members are present. I'm going to call the Solar Array Task Force to order. We will start with agenda item number 2, approval of the minutes from May 10th. Any changes, discussions? Good. Take a motion to approve. Okay. Got a motion to approve from Jay. Second from Paul. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Okay, passes unanimously. And then we'll move on to agenda item number 3, educational presentation by Clark Dietz. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Tanya Westfall with Clark Dietz. I'm a licensed professional civil engineer and lead accredited professional. We've been working with the city for the past couple years and the Waterworks Commission on the solar project that is in the past. We've been asked to come here and talk a little bit about education, solar in general, and to try to incorporate some answers to the questions that have been asked here by the task force, and also collected at the couple public information meetings that were held previously. So I put together a handout that will follow along with this presentation. The PowerPoint I have here is a little bit more abbreviated. It has almost all the slides, but maybe not as much text. And that's so you can kind of take that home, look at it. I mean, there was a little bit of guessing on the level of information you needed here. Happy to expand on it. If you think I'm running too long, feel free to cut me off. But I'm going to go very quickly through these. If you'd like me to slow down, let me know. But the request was maybe about 5 minutes at the most. And I think I have about 12 slides here. So we'll run through pretty quickly. How do I, oh.
I can advance, others there might be a clicker down there. We could.
I don't see it.
Okay.
I'll just raise my hand or something. So in essence, solar takes the sun's energy and converts it to a usable form of power for you. So next. There's widely published benefits of solar. I went to a few sources and found some information here. There's a lot of information published on that, and I don't think we need to belabor that here in specific detail. So we can go on to the next one. A few solar facts, and some of this ties into some of the questions that have been asked. Most of solar panels and equipment are made in China. So globally, about 80%. The U.S. is a far away second at 5%, and then a combination of other countries produce the panels themselves, and the equipment in particular is mostly manufactured in China. I've underlined manufactured because there's a lot of talk about Canadian panels and corporations in Canada. Those exist, but much of their production happens in China. Solar panels can be recycled after about a 30-year life. That 30 years is starting to increase depending on which product you use and as products become more evolved. There were questions about glare. There is some glare with solar panels, very little in relative terms, and panels are designed to absorb light, so most of the glare is directed up. Durability of panels. They're designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, so something like 160 mile per hour winds. The glass is shatterproof, so even if there's a crack, you won't get shattering. Next slide, please. So in terms of how solar generation is used, this first slide talks about how you connect. So you can generate solar energy and connect it right to the user. Or you can generate solar power and connect it to the grid. How the power is used is directly connected to the ownership model, your regulatory framework, and the financing available. And we'll talk about that in a couple more slides. So next one. In general terms, return on investment for a solar array is 8 to 11 years. Now, that's a United States statistic, not a Wisconsin, Marathon County, City of Wausau, Wisconsin Public Service number. That information gets developed once the project is a little bit more developed, but that number continues to decrease, and a big part of that is some of the more recent legislative and financing rules that are in place, and we'll talk about that as we go as well. Why solar has increased in all markets is because the cost of solar has decreased over 50% in the last 10 years. In some markets, even over 70%. On a longer, maybe more than 10 years, some reductions have been 80+%. So this is a means of generating power that has become more cost effective than traditional fossil fuel generation of power. Just something of note, and this was from a 2020 statistic. Wisconsin sends about $15 billion out of state annually to meet our energy needs. Local solar will keep that money in Wisconsin. That's another reason it's been something important to people in Wisconsin and other states. So next slide. So here's where I talked about how funding opportunities have changed recently. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, this is the single most aggressive and important thing that has changed for non-taxed entities. So the reason in the past you may have heard people say, can't we have so-and-so build a solar facility for us, and because they're doing it over here in another location. That was because under the rules before the Inflation Reduction Act, only entities that pay taxes could monetize the 30% tax credit. You at your home could do the same thing. With the provisions in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, non-tax entities like municipalities can get a direct payment in lieu of taxes. The other thing you can do is finance it with tax-exempt debt, although that formula then decreases from 30%. So for the first time ever, really, non-tax entities have been able to appreciate this up to 30% sort of tax monetization, for lack of a better term. This is where I talked about in terms of limitations and the regulatory framework. So in Wisconsin, there's a net metering limit. If you are a non-electric utility generator of power that's over 20 kilowatts, and you intend to sell that power, you are required to interconnect to the grid and work with your utility on interconnect agreement and sell that energy back to them at a discounted rate. That rate is generally much lower than the savings you would get from using your electricity that you generate. Just as of note, the plant is new, right? Like all of the work that have been done in the past on cost models and that sort of thing doesn't reflect the new plant, nor does it reflect the Inflation Reduction Act or other things we're talking about here today. So your water plant uses 15,000 kilowatt hours per month over the last 2 months. So there's a significant amount of power being used there, and it's between your water plant and I don't know where the wastewater plant sits, but plants in municipalities are the biggest users of electricity. So why that matters is because if you think back to the slide that said you can either direct connect or you can interconnect with the utility and sell them the power, that's why having a big user of electricity near your array is an opportunity. So, next slide, please. So there were some questions about winter climates and does this even work for a place where we have a lot of winter and snow? So you have this in your packet, you can probably see a little bit better, but the net of it is that, so Germany is a leader in solar generation globally. Wisconsin has a 20% increase in resource of solar than Germany does. This chart shows what can be generated per month, per panel, in each month. So there's generation of power in every month throughout the year in Wisconsin. So this information is, again, it's all relative and it's average through the state. When you look toward putting together a facility yourself, the sun's radiance, weather data, angle of your panels for your specific location goes into a model to develop what you will produce, how big your array needs to be, what part of the day you'll use the power. And all of that happens during a design phase more than here, but there's a way to maximize your operations in line with when power is available. All of this also gets used to look at sizing of your array and how much you want to use and how much you want to get from another source. So next slide. These are just some broader impacts, and this data comes from SEIA. They're kind of the leading organization on solar. They have a pretty large membership, all the way from residential contractors and designers to global companies that supply products, build utility scale, several hundred megawatt facilities. And what was of note here, in the state of Wisconsin, we're ranked 11th in the nation over the next 5 years for growth. If you look at where we are now, we're something like 23rd where we're sitting. So the direction Wisconsin is going is a relatively quick pace. There's already almost 200 solar companies operating in Wisconsin, and that doesn't count all the sort of periphery type businesses that are related to that. The other one is U.S. data, and I put that in there. I thought it was really interesting, so I thought maybe others would. We don't have to go over that, but so the next slide. There was some question about construction. What does this look like? What do the panels look like? What does the infrastructure look like? So these are some photos from actual installations in the Midwest. The panels range in height. On the high side, in general, you'd be 14 to 16 feet high. Now, there's stationary panels and then there's tracking panels. And technology is always evolving. So keep in mind, this is all very general and it's based on what's already happened, right? Installation of racking for panels is generally on posts or piles. So they're driven piles or helical piles. And if you look at in the middle picture at the top, you can see some of the type of equipment that's on site. So in terms of construction, it's relatively quiet and low impact for construction. Now, certainly there's vehicles driving all over your construction site, so you will have some disturbance. Construction doesn't take place without that. But in relative terms, it's less impact. On the lower left areas, that's some of your electrical equipment. So inverters, transformers, there's some underground conduit that's installed as well. That's usually installed at 3 feet deep, and oftentimes, again, relatively small equipment that installs that. You aren't going to have I think most people can probably have seen a full-size excavator putting in a sewer pipe on a street. You generally are not going to see anything like that out here. There are some concrete pads. Again, not a lot of them, so there will be some concrete trucks that would come out here, relatively minimal. Access to these sites is generally via a gravel road, and that's for maintenance vehicles in the future. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. If you want to go to the next slide, here's some more construction Oh, sorry, not construction pictures. These are finished pictures. So top and bottom right are actual photos of projects that have been built in Wisconsin. The one to the lower right shows a neighborhood relatively close. The photo to the left is the render that probably some of you have seen in the past. That's a render of the site on Tierney and Bugme. No modifications have been made to that. I pulled that from previous discussions, so it's really just there to show how you can prepare something before you build it to help people understand what it might look like. So vegetated, mostly green space. There are some stormwater management that has to be addressed on these because of water running off the panels. But again, nothing like full pipe networks or catch basins or infrastructure to that level. In terms of property values, that was another thing that was asked about. And there's been a fair amount of studies on that from a conservative perspective, there's no noticeable difference in value. Many times there's an increase in value.
Because there's a lot different.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Let her finish her presentation, and we can find sources afterwards.
yeah. So one of the things that isn't in this presentation, there's guidance on how you should or how you could talk to stakeholders in your community and helping site solar arrays. Some funding agencies, now again, sometimes for smaller communities, sometimes for much larger, have put more weight into projects that have arrays located in areas where you could use them as an educational feature. So having them in more populated areas or disadvantaged areas have become a positive thing for people scoring for providing funding. What that tells me is that it's a desirable thing by some people's standards and in many communities. You all have to decide that for your own community. Next slide. We just have a couple more. Operation and maintenance, there was a question of who's going to take care of this? Do we have enough manpower? What's involved? So the articles to the right are just headlines from various sources. The oldest one's from 2020, 2 are from 2023. Operation and maintenance is relatively low. In fact, significantly much lower than running another type of power generation facility, which is why you've seen companies who are utility companies putting up solar arrays themselves. It just cash flows in the capital side of things and in operation and maintenance. In terms of operation and maintenance for someone who owns one, there are times you may have to remove snow. Many times it will slide off itself. The other thing we see sometimes here in the spring is a lot of pollen. You may have to take a day and get the pollen off of there. Otherwise, for the most part, someone would drive out to the site with a pickup truck and do a routine check on everything, make sure everything's running fine, nothing's broken, there hasn't been any vandalism, and fencing, I guess, is something you would also take a look at, but otherwise maintenance is very low. I think there were some questions about what if some panels break. In the beginning of a project, you would generally buy some of the same panels, keep them on hand in case you have to replace them. Panels are intended to be, per OSHA, a one-man lift. So by design, their size, so one person could take a panel off and put it back on without injuring themselves. Next slide. Noise and aesthetics, there were questions about how loud is this facility. So an inverter is about 45 decibels. If you go into Google, you'll find all kinds of things. Some of them will say they're 25, some will say 50. 45 is kind of more common. There are different kinds of inverters, so you'll have a different sound coming out of those. That's about the sound of a fan or a normal conversation. Despite that being a relatively small amount of noise, inverters are usually placed as far away from neighbors as possible to mitigate that even more. There were questions about what does it look like under these panels. Pollinator habitats are becoming very common under panels. You can put sheep in there and use them for agricultural purposes. Less popular, that tends to happen more if there's a rural array that maybe utility company has owned, very large scale, and they've worked with an agricultural producer to have that. It comes with the same challenges you have if you have animals grazing on non-solar land. So pollinator habitats have been one of the most common things on solar arrays. And that's it. So I'll take questions if you have some. Your packet has a little bit more information. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee? I guess I had a couple. The 30% tax credit, is that towards the construction of, is that the total cost of the construction? Is it 30% of that?
It's relatively complex. So, no. Yes and no.
Okay.
And also the program's not fully established, and let's say you had the thing built right now this minute, you couldn't ask for your money because the money is still at the federal level. So how about I put something together for you on that?
Okay.
Would that be all right?
Sure.
It's relatively complex.
Okay. And then, what else did I have here? There was talk of maybe walking paths or something through the sites. But this is going to be fenced in.
Yeah,
Just
so
elaborate
this
on that
is
a little bit.
this is a power generation facility, so it needs to be fenced for everyone's protection. Generally, there's a fence. You put the road next to the fence or some kind of buffer so that the panels all sit further in. And then if you need to maintain it, you'd come in through a ring road or one that maybe bisects it. But there's certainly opportunities to do something outside the fence, but you don't want people where you're generating electricity.
Sure. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you for the presentation. When you were discussing the noise, you noted the noise of the inverter. If we were to look at having solar panels that moved and tracked the sun, I think there were a few questions also about any potential mechanical noise from the movement of those panels. Is that something to be concerned with?
I don't think so, but I can get you an actual rating on that. I don't know what that is offhand.
Okay. And then the other question I had, and I don't know, how much work you've done on this project thus far, but as far as conducting some sort of site location study, what does the power generation potential look like if we were to keep the majority of those trees on Bugby versus going to a more manicured landscaping? I'm just kind of curious. I think the trees have been important.
Yeah,
to people.
Previously we put together sort of 3 different sizes. One was maximize the property, one was disturb no trees, and the third one was somewhere in between. And I believe the smallest one was about 0.5 megawatt, which is still a reasonable size facility. Your old plant, I believe we estimated at almost 2. Do you remember, was it 2 million? We would have needed a 2 megawatt system, or 1.8, to power the old plant.
The smallest array, could you repeat that number again?
I think it was about 500, or 0.5 megawatt.
Okay.
But I can send you something if you want. I mean, there's some published presentations we had put together here, and I just didn't look that one up.
Okay.
To revisit it.
And then, has anybody looked at supplementing with rooftop solar panels? I don't know the exact orientation of the buildings that are on site, or the new building, the GAC building, if that's something that we may want to look at just in terms of a supplement if we want a smaller solar array.
Yeah, we had not been asked to look at that at all.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Are there any geotechnical, when the utility looked at it, we were looking at different locations on the site. What are the geotechnical requirements for placement?
So, the ground needs to be not muck, essentially, in terms of if you think of if you're driving a pile or a helical pile, needs something to catch on. I mean, I don't know the level of people's background here, so if I'm speaking a little bit too elementary, I apologize for that. But you need to be able to have a relatively consistent subsurface conditions so that if you're driving in a pile, it doesn't get stuck on debris, rebar. And when we looked at the entire site, sites to the north were an old construction landfill. And we worked with the city water department to do backhoe excavations out there and kind of mapped where there was underground concrete, rebar, maybe some old culverts, asphalt, and it was pretty extensive to the north, which would leave a very small, technical investigation would have to occur before you would do design, to help design the pile dimensions, the depth, and installation method.
I have a couple questions on this, the sourcing of the panels. If IRA funds are used for those, is there a requirement that they be domestically produced, or do you know that?
I think the answer to that is probably yes. Under Buy America, Build America. The steel generally would have to, I mean, but there isn't, all of the guidance isn't there. I think we would assume probably,
Yeah.
but we'd have to check that.
And that could affect timeframes and that sort of thing too, as capacity needs to build.
Yeah, so in that chart that looked at national information, it maybe had showed Q4 of 2022 had kind of a dip in solar. A big part of that was commodities and all of these ships that were stuck. So even though there was an affinity for solar, there wasn't supply. So just like everything else, there are supply chain issues with this one.
Yeah, the other question is related to resiliency. And I just have this kind of simplistic idea that if we can make our own electricity, that we can run at least part of the plant without the grid. Is that a potential?
It is. It absolutely is. So you would look at critical equipment and what you could power on that side of things. The plant also has a fuel generator on site to help with that, but that's part of what has driven other projects for utilities, for water utilities. So some published data will talk about being able to generate your own because of the demands that will be put on the electrical system for this increase in electric vehicles, lawnmowers. I mean, this trend toward going electric and getting away from fossil fuels is
Yeah.
putting a big strain on the infrastructure. And it'll take them much longer to do something than it would someone on a small scale.
Even home heating, going to heat pumps and
Right,
that sort of
right.
thing, yeah. But, that, it's not, doesn't seem to be an often mentioned benefit, but having potable water is pretty important
True.
for people's health. So.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, on that, but as a water utility, you have to talk about resiliency in your reporting on the water side, and threats to your system. You guys have emergency response planning, and it does include security, resiliency of your infrastructure as well as your controls, your billing, any number of things, so.
this with warm water?
Looking for an aerial view.
So you already mentioned geo testing would have to be done there to get a proposal going. I guess if we decide to go there, or if we decide to go elsewhere, what are some of the key decisions we need to make to help you guys
To move a
to move a
design project forward?
Yes.
So there needs to be an understanding of the ownership model, right? Like, do you want to own all of this yourself? Do you want to size it in terms of using all of the power? Do you want to size it by based on the size you have available, maximizing it, the land you have available, maximizing keeping trees there? So where the thing will go and what size it'll be. The other thing is the new plant has not been evaluated for need. And then, so there's the need today, and then there's the 30 years out on what you would use for power. All of the work that was done previously took the old plant and kind of extrapolated it based on relative ratio of size. Now there will be data available on actual usage. Geotech comes in after you've selected your site, and it can be done really at any time after that. You'd have surveying of a site. So if we're talking about the site adjacent to the water plant, that already has been surveyed, so that's ready. So really a decision on the size that you want this to be, and more so the location.
Okay, that's all I had. Anything else, guys? Oh, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
And then if there's any more questions, are you going to be available to stick around after the meeting?
Absolutely, I'll stay.
All right, thank you. Okay, next we have on the agenda discussion and possible action on solar power and the city of Wausau's vision. So I don't know if, Eric, you put some of this together, if you want to kind of go over what you were thinking here. It should be in the packet. It's like 6 bullet points, 7 bullet points.
Design of the new water treatment facility. It was part of that discussion. It was something we were going to look at once the facility was designed up and constructed. And so we're into that point right now. And so we're trying to mesh with the goals that all of you had discussed at the last meeting, along with what the city has discussed or actually has in place. And so we look at, from the utility side, we want to look at all ratepayers of the utility and what the benefits are overall for the ratepayers throughout the entire city. And not only the current one, overall for the ratepayers throughout the entire city. And not only the current ones, but, for future. And how do we maintain rates and prevent, or minimize future rate hikes? And so this would be a step in that right direction as well. Back to your point on resiliency, we're always looking for ways to have, making sure we have resiliency, redundancies throughout the plant, right? We've designed for those, we've put those inside the plant, and this would be something else that would fall in line with that as well. So utility, but I think it's like for all of our projects, the city's looking at a path for a new DPW site, right? To put up a new facility for a maintenance facility, and what does that look like in that area that we're going to put that up, and how does that benefit the city and the ratepayers and the taxpayers within the city as well? And so I think just to have an overall goal of solar and maybe a direction on what that is, I think that is something that I would like to get out of this task force that we're having from all of you.
Okay. So those bullet points are kind of listed in the packet. Anyone have any comments, or do we want to discuss any of those listed out? Yeah, go ahead, John.
the providing public education and an opportunity for public input, I think is really thing. It's just so easy to get stalled and then be criticized for being stalled. It's just so easy to get stalled and then be criticized for being stalled. That it helps to get some forward momentum.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on where you would like to see educational, or how to present it? I mean,
Yeah, that's it. I mean, in terms of like the
yeah, how to better
yeah.
not have negative.
Well, I think it's important to have facts so that people talk about something that's real and not, what somebody's cooked up in their discussions with other folks. And I don't know what the best forum for that is. It's probably a mixture of lots of things, right? The
Right.
communication that we have available here. But I don't. There are probably people that know. I hope there are people that know more about that than I do. But
I thought maybe you had something specific.
yeah.
Go ahead, Paul.
The public information meetings that were held at NTC, I don't know, those were a year, maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah.
No, they were well attended. People came. I think there is a desire to learn about these things. So I think one outlet could certainly be scheduling those public information meetings, but throughout the city, or and I don't know if there are, one this week, one the next week, or
That are laid out. I attended those meetings, and I quite honestly I think they could have and should have been run differently in terms of presenting the background information, looking at options, and then getting comments on them. They weren't as organized as perhaps they could have been in terms of sharing information. In fact, if you wanted to, another option would be to do what DOT does a lot, is just bring in various schematic drawings and having people there to collect input and raise concerns. So there's a number of ways you've got to do that. But I think I agree with Jay, is that one of the reasons why we're here is to sort of develop the background, the information, and present it, and then get feedback. And the question is at what point do we collect that feedback, and how will that feedback be used? Because you've got people in the audience, if we're soliciting their input in earnest, we need to know what.
Would that be a future meeting, or discuss it now? There is the provide citywide educational outreach is number 7 on the list. Are we ready to discuss it now, I guess? Or-
I think the overall lifespan of the task force is a year, right? That's what our mandate is anyway, right?
Okay.
So, and I think everybody wants to move forward with, what are we going to do in that kind of time frame? So if we back up from that, we've got to have some realistic options out there, at some midpoint, and like 3/4 of the way through, before any decisions made, before it's too late to pull the plug or change direction, you get some public feedback.
But they can get redo a proposal, just with input, and then I guess, and that's why I asked what else we need to discuss here. To actually move this forward and get them a proposal. One of the items they brought up was interconnection versus direct connection. I guess, how do we as a committee feel about that? And maybe we might need a little bit more information on it, right, if you have it. So my understanding is direct connect is, it connects directly to the utility
Right.
and is only used on site and nothing is sold.
So, yes and no. So when I put this together, I didn't make the presumption that you had a site selected, right? So if you're adjacent to your user, you would benefit from a direct connect. That was the path that we went down before. You would always engage your utility regardless, in terms of putting this system together. It's a matter of sizing your facility on if you'll use all of your power as it's generated, and if you don't, do you want to sell it back? But you also are first using it before you sell the excess. In the interconnect way, I've simplified it, everything you generate, you're putting back in and you're buying it back from them, probably at a,
I understand. So interconnect would be if we wanted to put it out in the middle of a cow pasture somewhere.
correct, yes. And use their infrastructure to get it, to essentially say we're buying green power.
Which we would have to pay to use their infrastructure, basically is what the reduced cost comes down to. Or the reduced.
Right,
selling
because
it.
in Wisconsin, you, right now, are not allowed to be a third-party generator of electricity at that scale. It would take legislation to change that. Which probably won't happen this year. It's been introduced a couple times, but it's not there yet.
So that would be the benefit of having it locally
That's
there,
correct.
right there by it. Okay.
Yes.
Is
Go ahead.
is the discount that, so there's, another way of saying it is there's at least twice the benefit to putting it on site as locating it somewhere where it'd be tied into the grid.
In terms of straight kilowatt hour, yes. Now, you are also taking on the capital cost of this, and you have to account for paying for that. But the ROI then gets calculated based on paying back your capital. And last time it was up to 20 years in one of the scenarios because there was a sellback that was included at, it was either 2.4 or 2.7. So all of that changes based on the sizing of your array, and there was not the IRA payment in lieu of taxes last time, and the lowest at a couple years ago was maybe 11 or 12 years. So that was the caveat with the US ROI for private projects was something like 8 to 11, trending down, but.
So we get back once again to, let's get some real information on the table and,
Yeah, I mean, there's a philosophical approach to this too. If you're building something, if you think about it in terms of what you know, electricity tends to go up 2% a year. Again, this is broad data. This has nothing to do with Wisconsin Public Service. 2% a year. The array infrastructure in general lasts 30 years. At the end of it, you have the ability to recycle or upgrade, continue to use it. Your electrical equipment, like inverters and transformers, the maintenance is built in, so, but it's relatively low cost to maintain and replace those as you go. So in looking at your ROI being where you think it needs to be versus the life of the system,
If we were to go forward with a solar project, it would make sense to have it locally to the utility, to the water utility there, so we could directly use it. And we have heard last meeting, all the questions that the community had. And we're going to cover those next here. With their concerns in mind, do you have enough to propose something? Or to get, to start some of the financial numbers going, to get return on investments and,
Well, if, I'll make some assumptions, tell me if it's right or wrong. The array would go,
That we need to figure
Because
out.
we've also talked about berming
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
It-
oh, sorry.
ahead.
That one render showed a rendered berm on Tierney, as presented previously. I mean, it was about a 40-foot wide area that was buffered on the west side of Tierney, but I'll give you an idea what that looks like.
Yeah,
I'm
go
not,
ahead.
I'm not convinced that we've exhausted the evaluation of the entire site. I'd like to just look at the site again to see if there are alternative locations and opportunities on the existing site for placement of it. If there's aggregate that limits us in one area, is there a possibility to move that aggregate? We've heard from the neighborhood early on that have you looked at the entire site or other locations?
Go ahead, Paul.
Would there be value in looking at rooftop options? I don't know what the square footage, the area of those existing structures. I don't know how big the new building that will be constructed on the site will be, but would there be value in looking at adding rooftop panels as a supplement?
I think there would be.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at the square footage to supplement what would be on the ground too. Yep.
John is right. You can kind of put the small array here, another one here, another one here, but your costs will go up because you're going to have more underground infrastructure. And that's okay if you are okay with that. And that's a decision you guys have to make, but is the sky the limit? Are you trying to stay in a certain place? I mean, and that ties back into the ROI. So that's a thing to consider if you're going to move forward. So, thank you.
Okay.
And those could be options that we look at.
Yeah, and I'm not on the finance committee, so, but that might be a good question to bring up, what they would be able to stomach if we brought something forward.
If we were to pick a number, yeah, I mean, some
You want to come up with? I feel like we should, and that could be a guideline going forward for future projects. We're always looking for X return on investment. I heard 10 years quite often. I know corporate world now, I mean, if your return on investment isn't 3 years, they don't even look at it. I think that's pretty aggressive for us. But I really like that 10-year return.
Well, there's a guaranteed demand for water, so it's not like a corporate product, where
Correct.
there may be no demand for something 4 or 5 years.
And maybe when they bring in the designs and we're seeing numbers like 6 or 5, maybe we reevaluate that for future projects to going forward, but I think to get the ball rolling here, I think 10 is a good number. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item what number is that? Number 5. So I had Caitlin jot down a lot of the questions and or comments that were made at the last meeting, and I just kind of want to go through this and make sure we've talked about all of them or covered them all. Create full transparency. I feel that kind of goes back to our educational, coming up with some type of, and maybe that's something we do annually. I mean, as much as the stuff is changing. Go ahead, John.
But again, for what purpose? And I think we have to define what the purpose of the engagement is. I think we need to be transparent, but do we have a timeline on when we're going to develop options, or the decision is made to go ahead based upon the following criteria? We're looking at options. Here are 5 options, 4 options, 2 options, whatever. You know, meeting with people for the sake of meeting with them versus,
If you have a thought of how the schedule should go, that would be helpful. If you have a thought of how the schedule should go, that would be helpful. And I agree, at those community meetings, maybe we have comment cards at the end or something where any questions that you have that weren't answered, that you don't feel like you spoke out about or were too shy to speak out about, you could write it down and we could add that to the presentation the next time around, you know. Go ahead, Paul.
I agree that a schedule is a good idea. Being able to provide specific information at some point will be really important. I do think there is some value.
Create a buffer and leave trees where we can. I think that's been covered quite extensively here, which I think goes back to making sure we do a full site survey and see if there's more of that site to the north that we can use and not disturb any trees, I guess. Work to not negatively impact the neighborhood. Explore potential developments for the land for the next 30 years. I guess we didn't really talk about that, but, you know, what, I guess, Eric, any thoughts there on what other potential?
Previously, it was platted before for residential, right? So, and with streets being,
What it could be, other than, and I think weighing that in the decision.
yes.
And then opportunities to incorporate community engagement in the property. I mean, if the solar goes there, it sounds like it's going to be all fenced off as like a power generation site, as like, I think a WPS down in Rothschild there, you can't get in, you can't get anywhere near it, you know. Perhaps around the outside, it sounded like there could be some things. If we leave trees, any other thoughts there? Go ahead, Paul.
And it may be worth putting out a survey in the neighborhood or continuing conversations with the community, you know, if there is a possibility for some sort of walking trail, recognizing it has to be, you know, some distance from this facility, but is that something that the neighborhood would be interested in, and what would that look like? I think that's worth considering.
Yeah. Okay, city budget goals, let's, I think this was a lot of what Eric's bullet points were, different sizes of the raise and how it offsets power. I think with a 10-year ROI goal, I think that gives you a good size to shoot for. Capitalize on federal funding opportunities. I didn't know about non-tax collecting. Another reason in my mind that to think that this is a good, another reason in my mind that to think that this is a good site for this stuff.
Do we know how that would work? I mean, how the tech would be engaged with the contractor or the utility or whatever? There's other models for that, how that's happened?
I can only speak from people I know who have gone through the tech. I don't think they would be there for the install as much. But with it right on site, I don't know, access to that, inside that fence area, is that something that you could give tours of? And then would the utility own that fenced-in area? So it'd be up to the utility to,
Yeah, it would be just,
being it in the books is one thing, but then being able to actually go out and tour something and see it really it helps me learn. So I think there's a great opportunity there. On the sustainability goals, we talked about the lifestyle of the panels, percentage of the plant that the project would be helping. I imagine with the 10-year ROI, you'd be able to use that number to help determine what percentage of the plant. But just a rough guess, would we, in the summertime, be able to completely power the utility?
It all depends on the size of your array, right? So there was a scenario that maximized the site that would be able to provide power based.
Interesting to get the engineer's perspective on that, but my, civilian sense of that is that that might be a phase two. I mean, there's a lot going into battery production and lithium availability, and, it seems like the cost on all of those things should be coming down over the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe, get this installed and operational, and then, okay, we could use the existing array or maybe expand it and put some storage, or it does seem responsible to lay out those steps, at least kind of conceptually, as part of this project, as potential future phases of the development. But
Sure.
the engineers would know a lot better than I do.
I guess, yeah, my questions would be, how big are the batteries? I've seen car batteries and stuff, but to actually get a power utility.
Yeah, so that would be part of the information that's provided, kind of at the public information phase, that this, this actually, what is the actual net impact over the life of the project?
Sure. Maybe we can add that to the presentation. Go ahead, Paul.
I think you mentioned 30 years as a life cycle for the panels themselves. But would that be just the panel? Would the frame or the structure that holds those panels, would those, in theory, last longer than 30 years?
You could
So it
use-
would be a
yes.
replacement of the panel, not the entire,
Correct. The racking would accommodate new panels.
okay, thank you.
So 30 years is about the time that the efficiency drops enough, based on data available now, that you would potentially replace your entire set of panels.
And then the fourth item there is, so that'll be the community engagement.
We'll have a plan and, subject to a draft, because I think that it's important that everybody comment on it.
Yep. No, I think that'd be a great agenda item for the next one. Any other thing else you wanted to hear talk about for the next meeting? Go ahead, John.
Can we get an update on where we are with, I think you said we're using 15 kilowatts per month. Could we get an update on cost to operate the plant? We've now got a number of years. And then, I don't know, Eric, if there's any way to project the cost to operate the GAC system when that's up and operational. But can we begin to develop some of those baseline information?
Yeah, I mean, I know we can get the baseline information for what the plant's running right now. I'd have to check with Donahue, see if they ran what they think that, with the GAC system up and running, what that potentially would be, So right now, it's about 40 grand a month that the water utility's paying. But we'll compile that information for you as well.
We also wanted to do a site plan or availability of,
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Size options.
yeah, and I guess do we have enough information to you, Clark Dietz, to get a 10-year return on investment, like what that would look like?
I'll get you something. It may not be exactly the system you're looking at, but I think in relative terms, you can use it for comparison at least.
Yeah.
So, yes. I had my homework is also getting you information on the Inflation Reduction Act and how you get that money and can use it.
Yeah, so maybe another presentation on that. A little deeper dive into that.
Okay.
Any other notes anyone has or thoughts? We'll also be going over the minutes to see if we,
Then, what space is available on the Bugby property, if all the trees were left. I mean, I have some other information to just get back with you, and can send that ahead of time if you are a little more aggressive. It's really just the ROI calcs. Because we are gonna have to obtain some information from WPS. And it's beyond our control and how long it takes to get that. So that's probably a month out.
okay. Okay. Caitlin brought the calendar up. The week of July 17th is open as far as this room and being able to make sure we keep recording these meetings other than Monday. Well, I'll be here on Monday anyway. We want to stay away from Wednesdays. Is there a meeting on Tuesday there, John?
County
At the
board-
county?
County board at 7,
At 7?
and human resources at 3, so.
Okay. So Tuesday's no good.
Thursday
Thursday?
works for me.
Thursday we could, yeah,
20th,
20th? Okay.
4:35, 6.
5, is 5 a good time? I feel like that's pretty standard.
And it opened up a folder with a flyover.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Has Clark Dietz done a solar project like this?
Yeah, we've done about 100 megawatts of solar design.
Similar
We
size,
will see you soon.
Yeah,
roughly similar.
yeah.
Performance